Welcome everyone to today's ViodiTV real-time conversation. We are going to talk advanced air mobility in rural areas and beyond. And boy, do we have the crew to do that. I guess piloting and co-piloting us today are Anna Dietrich from CAMI, the Community Air Mobility Initiative, and Daryl Swanson, Director of Swanson Aviation Consultancy. And I don't know what your role would be, Matt. I guess we're the stewards on the aircraft or something. Matt Polka, my friend from ACA Connects, the president and CEO, he's going to be running commentary. So this topic should be of interest to everyone, because this is going to be the broadband maybe of the 2020s. Who knows what and how it's going to change life, but I think it's going to change life in ways we don't know. And it's ironic because right now we're going through some of the oddest times probably any of us have lived through, and we're going to get out of this. And Anna, you kind of inspired today's conversation. We'll start with you, but earlier or last week, I wrote a very brief synopsis of an excellent event that the Air Force put together, Agility Prime, and you spoke at that. And what inspired me was this idea of, a phoenix rising from the ashes. Right now we're focused on the bad stuff, but I think the stuff that you guys are involved with is going to be this change. So why don't we start kind of with what you're going to talk about, which is bringing this new kind of air mobility to communities and getting communities involved. And then we'll transition to Daryl and what it means from an infrastructure standpoint. And then we'll have a discussion. So Anna, if you could
Sure.
take it.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Ken. And yeah, I think, sometimes it feels a little silly to be talking about, flying cars and urban air mobility and all of that while we're in the middle of a pandemic. But I think the arc of progress is long, and it's wonderful to be able to maintain some momentum and do things virtually like this in the meantime. So I think this is good work, and I'm glad we're able to continue it. I'm going to speak a little bit briefly about what is urban air mobility, what are the aircraft that are making this possible, and introduce the organization that I co-founded not quite a year ago now as resources for folks that are interested in bringing this to their communities. So, what is urban air mobility? So the Community Air Mobility Initiative defines this pretty broadly. NASA uses the term advanced air mobility, which is basically the same thing. And what we're talking about is 5 different zones of operation for air travel using smaller aircraft than what most of us are used to. So inside the city center is what usually comes to mind when people speak about urban air mobility, but it's also suburbs to city to edge city, rural access, which is I think our focus today, and then hub airport access. And then types of operation, it's not just air taxis, that's certainly part of it, but we also have an airline model for micro haul flights on a schedule. We have Air Metro, which you could think of as kind of like a city bus loop, but with eVTOL aircraft. Then of course the airport shuttle and emergency services is something that I think has a lot of application, particularly in rural settings as well. So it's a broader conversation than is often sort of what comes to mind initially when somebody says UAM. And what is enabling all of this? So there's new aircraft that are being developed now. They are quite real. There's a spectrum of sort of technical progress that's been made to date. Some aircraft are still in concept stage, of course, but others are nearing certification and have been doing flight tests for years. By my estimations from the industry, we had between 1,000 and 2,000 test flights of full-size aircraft last year alone. So this is something that is happening, and it is happening today from a technology development perspective. And the cool new twist that these aircraft have is that they take off straight up and down like a helicopter, but they use electric motors. So they're quieter, they're safer, they're cheaper to operate, and they enable missions that are much more tightly integrated into the fabric of a community and an existing transportation landscape than the other aircraft that we're used to seeing today. Just because they can be integrated into a community doesn't mean people are going to want them to be integrated into the community, however. So public acceptance is something that is very important. And by that, I don't mean the industry just coming along and saying, here's a cool plane, you will use it in this way. No, quite the opposite. So the mission of the Community Air Mobility Initiative, and something that's very close to my heart, is equipping people, people in general, but especially local decision makers, so state and local planners and DOTs and people that set policy at the local level to have the information that they need to ask the right questions to do this in a way that maximizes the benefit for their communities. So we could talk for hours about all the different pieces of this circle here and the different puzzle pieces that have to come together to do this well. I won't. I'll just let them sit there and say that it's a much broader conversation than is usually assumed with just noise. I just want to briefly introduce myself. I came at the Cool Things That Fly industry as the founding chief operating officer of Terrafugia, which started to do erodible aircraft back in 2006. I am now very involved in certification and government relations and public policy in the eVTOL space. And Yolanka Wolf is my co-executive director and co-founder with CAMI. She comes at this from a nonprofit law perspective and also with a lot of electric aircraft experience. I just briefly want to thank the members that have stepped up to financially support CAMI so far. We are a 501c3 educational nonprofit, so we wouldn't be able to do any of this work without those folks. So thank you. And what's the work that we're doing? We are building out a resource library. We are doing virtual events. We are trying to, as our little catchphrase says, support the responsible integration of the third dimension at the state and local level. So we want to provide educational information, foundational knowledge, questions, resources, things that people need to integrate this well and to maximize the benefit while mitigating what will be some level of unavoidable negative impact, but making that as small as possible. So benefits, why would you bother to do this? I've put in green the ones that I think are probably the most directly relevant for rural applications, but all of these sort of apply across the board. The increasing the range of access to the urban core is one that is, of course, particularly of interest to communities that maybe don't have access to the economic opportunities, they don't have access to the healthcare there, they don't have access to educational resources, museums, those kinds of things, nearly so conveniently as folks that live much closer into the city. So this would increase the range of influence and access for those major cities. It also significantly can reduce emergency response times. So where you might take an hour to get an ambulance to the scene of a medical emergency, you could do a first responder insertion with an eVTOL aircraft in a matter of minutes. So it really is a significant improvement in terms of medical access, emergency response. And also a lot of rural communities do in fact have access to a GA airport, so traditional local community airport. And some of those may not be the economic engines that they once were or were envisioned to be. And I think urban air mobility and eVTOL and electric aircraft can breathe new life into the usefulness of that infrastructure as well. So there's some real opportunities to leverage things that may already exist in a community for further economic growth. And workforce development, not just building aircraft, but operating them, maintaining them, managing vertiport operations, all of those pieces are part of this puzzle as well. And just real quickly to give a sense of what we're talking about in terms of increase of range. So folks generally spend about the same amount of time commuting throughout history. So when we could walk, we would go about 3 miles in a day. When we started having horses, we would go about 10. The Model T got us up to about 45, modern car, 70 plus. And now with an eVTOL aircraft with conservative range estimates, we're looking at being able to travel 150 miles over the course of a day using the same time transportation budget that we generally use in our daily lives. So that amount of time that we spend traveling hasn't changed much for a long time, but how far we've been able to go with it has. So this is sort of that doubling or more of our sort of range of influence and opportunity. Now, that's very exciting to me. And that's my prepared remarks. So I will stop talking here and let Daryl give his spiel and then be happy to join in the discussion in a little while.
Yeah, Anna, that's great. And while Daryl is pulling up his slides, I think it's a perfect transition because, you were talking about getting the communities ready, and now he's going to talk about the infrastructure part. And, having run airports and having built infrastructure and urban planning, he brings a great level of knowledge to that area. So Daryl, whenever you're ready, I'll put myself on mute.
Right. Okay. Can you see the slide?
We can.
Right. Okay. So I'm Daryl Swanson. I started my own company a little over a year ago. I spent a lot of my career planning and designing airports around the world. I ran an airport in Tanzania. And then when I came back to Europe, I started helping people buy airports, which was really good fun. For good measure, I thought I would do an MBA, and my major paper was actually about buying HMS Ark Royal, an aircraft carrier, and floating it south of London City Airport to turn it into a vertiport. Well, a heliport initially. And that's really where I learned that noise is the key issue, which is why helicopters aren't really used in any form of mass transportation. So I've been waiting for Airwolf and Blue Thunder to come along with their whisper modes for a long time. So I looked into it a little bit more, and I eventually came up with a theory called distributed aviation, which is based on the economics of electric aviation. I'll take you through that now. So when we're talking about distributed aviation, it really comes down to economics, the economics of hydrocarbon versus the economics of electric aviation. And we all know that hydrocarbons have a huge amount of energy in them. But because of all that energy, the engines have to be incredibly complex because they're operating at temperatures above their melting point. So that means that they have high capital and high maintenance costs. They're only about 24% efficient, and the rest is heat and noise. And that's certainly something that you hear about by people living near airports. The operating economics of themselves actually require those aircraft to be large to operate over long ranges. And of course, this just makes aircraft large in general. Now, large aircraft require large airports, and they need that to process enough passengers to pay for the infrastructure. So this is where the economics of electric aviation really change the game and gross things up in terms of size and scale. Now, electric aviation is completely opposite of that. So it's almost a paradigm change that we're seeing here. So depending on who you're talking to, the battery technology is sufficient for 650 nautical miles for eVTOL aircraft, 10 to 19 passengers, and eVTOL aircraft, 130 nautical miles. And of course, we have hybrid options and lots of discussion about hydrogen powered aircraft in the very near future. So of course, those electric motors, really, there's only one moving part. So that means that they have lower capital, operating, and maintenance costs. And they're 94% efficient at getting that energy out of the battery and turning it into kinetic energy. And in the end, there are more small airfields that are closer to passengers' origins and destinations than large airports with great surface action. So that means that today's regional and GA airports could be tomorrow's sub-regional airports and eventually hubs. And then, of course, we start adding in vertiports in our city centers for those last mile. Now, to illustrate the point, this chart on the left here is talking about regional and turboprop aircraft. And you see on the bottom axis, they have more and more range. And on the left vertical axis, the seat capacity of those vehicles. Now, basically, what that means is that the OEMs, the manufacturers, are building all these aircraft with more and more range, more and more capacity, but the regional airlines are actually only flying them with a peaking out at about 200 nautical miles. Now, of course, this is exactly where eVTOL and eSTOL can fit quite happily. So if we take a look at the 2017 airport pairs in the United Kingdom, of which there are 48 airports, so in theory, 1,128 two-airport pair combinations. But in 2017, there was only 249 airport pairs, so only 22% of them were actually viable for hydrocarbon aviation. So that just says something about the economics of these aircraft that they're flying. And of course, we even prior to COVID, we had the failure of Flybe, which was a very important regional aircraft in the United Kingdom. So this chart shows the frequency, which is those orangey bars, and then that squiggly line from the top left to the bottom right is the range. So if we have an aircraft like Joby, they could access 24% of those 249 airport pairs from day one. So they can capture 22% of the market, so 8,500 frequencies without even really trying. So it really said something about the operating economics of electric. And of course, the Faradair Biha aircraft, which is represented here, that would be able to fly to all of them and beyond and get into Europe and probably parts of Southern Europe. We did a little bit more detailed analysis, and what we have here is a average one-way net fare price in the UK and Ireland. So the distance along the bottom axis, and on the left axis, we have the average one-way pair. So we're seeing all these airport pairs. And it really said to us that the price and ranges that passengers are flying, there is a market that is available for eVTOL operators to get into on day one, and indeed eSTOL aircraft operators as well. Now, of course, we decided not just to look at the UK as an example, as an island, but every country that we looked at, we found the same operating characteristics. So it was quite telling that electric aviation is just poised to get into this market. So this is just a bit of a history lesson on how we get back to distributed aviation, because we really had distributed aviation for a long time, and it started about 100 years ago. So this bug splat slide is really about a potential distribution of cities and road and rail connections. But of course, as soon as aviation came along, we had all these small airports serving these communities and their catchment areas. But as we got more efficient at extracting energy out of hydrocarbons, then everything started getting bigger. So all of a sudden, we had these larger hub and spoke type airports with their huge catchment areas, displacing the smaller airports. Now, in the 1970s, Freddie Laker came along with his airline and started the low-cost movement, where airlines were actually able to have the range that they would fly direct airport to direct airport and avoid the hubs altogether. So it was a different economic model. But of course, this is quite representative of aircraft like the 787, which is the hub buster, which they're just going direct point to point. But when we have electric aviation, all of a sudden, these smaller regional airports become much more relevant because they'll be able to operate on those routes where hydrocarbon aircraft would just fear to tread. And then, of course, once we have eVTOL, they'll be able to fill in the last mile, either from the airport to the city center or from city center to city center. So this is the power of an electric aviation model. So what I'm really seeing is the emergence of something called ELCCs, so electric low-cost carriers. And then once we have that, we're going to see this shift from the hub and spoke system of airports that we have to the smaller regional airports, so a proportion of that traffic will shift. But everybody's a winner. So the larger airports, they lose a proportion of that traffic. But what they actually gain back is the slots on those runways, which they can actually repurpose for long-haul international. And that's where hydrocarbon aviation is much more efficient. The smaller regional airports win because they get much needed traffic, and the passengers actually win because they're much closer to their origins and destination. And of course, because it's electric, the environment wins. Eventually, eVTOL fills the gap, and then we arrive at our distributed aviation model. So really, from a regional point of view, I'm actually seeing that regional electric aviation is going to come first, and that's largely because it's going to be a little bit easier to certify fixed-wing electric aircraft. And I also think that the current COVID-19 crisis is going to accelerate investment into the industry, and we'll see that through legacy carriers either failing or selling older aircraft and retrenching back to their thicker hub and spoke routes. We're also witnessing a loss of regional carriers. So that means that there's going to be a lot of pilots available to backfill these electric aviation routes. So I'm suspecting that we're going to see that development of sub-regional routes first. And again, it's because that's where hydrocarbon carriers fear to fly. And then just through the natural economics, we're going to see the establishment of sub-regional hubs. So some of those smaller airports will develop into hub-type operations. And of course, this is where eVTOL fills the gap. So that's my little bit. So I will hand back to you, sir.
Daryl, that was excellent. And before we go to you, Matt, with your impressions, we have a question from on YouTube here. And the question was, are eVTOL aircraft going to cost the same as a bus? I assume like a Greyhound bus or something.
Well, in terms of buying the airplane, I would say I don't know how much a bus costs. In terms of riding in the airplane,
I think a bus is about, I don't know, 500,000. I think a Proterra electric bus is between 750,000 and $1 million. So there's a price range.
Okay, so maybe in the same ballpark. Yeah.
That's an electric
I think that
bus.
we're talking about, I think we're talking about for the passenger ride in, I think we're talking about something that may 2 to 3 times the bus fare, but ultimately is anticipated to come down to be much more competitive.
I think the important thing to really think about is, yes, initially the fares on electric aviation are going to be much higher initially, and that's That's just very analogous of the very first commercial aviation flights. They were very expensive because in the end, it's business class passengers or passengers of high net worth that are actually able to pay for the infrastructure and the vehicles to get you there. As you reach commercial volumes, more and more volumes of vehicles flying and more destinations available, then the price comes down just through natural competition. So I think just to set an expectation, early days, it is going to be expensive, and that's fine because those people will pay for the infrastructure. But eventually, the price will come down to something that's a lot more affordable. And this is very important for electric aviation to flourish. We have to make it available to as many people as possible. Otherwise, there just won't be the acceptance of the infrastructure. And the infrastructure is actually the secret bottleneck that we have. Without the landing places available for these vehicles, there's no point doing any of this. We just may as well go home and do something else.
And the other thing to probably compare it to is the cost of existing hydrocarbon aviation, right? I mean, as opposed to the bus.
Yeah, so certainly in the aviation industry, we talk about something called average seat mile costs. So you take an aircraft that flies 1,000 miles, and if you have 1,000 passengers, you do the math, and then you come up with an average seat mile cost. And the same thing will happen with electric aviation, and the whole idea of moving to a commercial model is that you're driving down the average seat mile cost, so it's much more affordable to the wider public. And this is where I think that electric aviation needs to go to. And I'm not necessarily a huge fan of PAVs or personal air vehicles where an individual owns it, because for the noise footprint that they'll be putting out, there's just too much disbenefit to the local communities, as opposed to something that's more commercial, where more people are the beneficiaries of that type of transport.
You know, and Yolanda brought in a question about infrastructure, which we'll get to, but I want to pull Matt into this. Matt represents an organization of rural broadband ISPs, and they are the leaders in their communities. And I'll let Matt talk to that. But Matt, why don't you give us some of your initial impressions?
Sure.
We'll continue the conversation.
Well, first, thanks for having me, Ken. It's great to be here with Anna and Daryl and to listen to them about this fascinating subject. I have nothing to do with their industry other than just a true fascination all of my life, and as someone who travels a lot and who studies as much as I can about aviation. But as you said, I work in Washington, D.C. primarily on behalf of 800 smaller companies that are in the broadband phone and cable video business, and I work on their behalf before Congress, the Federal Communications Commission on Regulatory Legislative Policy, that helps to encourage more broadband deployment in smaller markets and rural areas. So one of my connections here is not only to talk with Anna and Daryl about the broadband aspects of what they're doing as they think about electric aviation, but also connecting rural areas to larger areas in the world. Our members are in very, very hard to reach areas all across the United States. They're in all 50 states. They're in many of the territories. I've been to many of these places where it's very, very hard to reach in a day or even 2 days sometimes. And the ability to connect up smaller markets, smaller airports, smaller towns with access to large cities and then the world is extremely important. And I live in a smaller city, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which at one point had a great hub airport here at Pittsburgh International with U.S. Airways, but then because of mergers, et cetera, it's become something much less of what it used to be. Now looking at how it's going to redesign its future, taking a huge terminal that was built back in 1992 and really shrinking it down to something more manageable. But in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis, and I'm thinking what Daryl said, I can almost see the planners now thinking, okay, how can we put on the books what we were already thinking about to shrink this airport and add in other aspects of electric aviation that could actually make it even more viable as an airport to reach many cities. So here in the state of Pennsylvania. So it's a fascinating subject, and one that I think has the possibility to truly transform many of the rural areas that I'm in, oftentimes to meet with and to see what our members are doing from a broadband perspective.
One of the things that we talked about was brought up in the questions, and we talked about it yesterday and kind of in our pre-discussion, was the whole idea of infrastructure. And obviously there's, these general aviation airports that are there, but they're going to need some modifications. Maybe if someone wants to talk to that.
Well, I think, Daryl's the airport guy, but I will make a comment just that, the broadband does in fact have similar applicability to making this new connectivity possible. I often talk about the communications infrastructure, 5G, strong internet connections, and the electric utility infrastructure as being the two sort of foundational pieces that have to be in place to have these aircraft operating certainly at volume, because they have to be able to exchange data with their sort of operations center, and they have to have energy available to charge. So both of those pieces really are foundational. And often those are the pieces that would need to be added to an existing airport. If you can do helicopter operations out of your GA airport, which you can out of most, if not all, you can do eVTOL and e-aircraft operations out of it. But having the internet connectivity and the charging infrastructure are things that may need to be added. But Daryl probably has more on that.
Well, sorry, I'm off. Lots to say on infrastructure. Infrastructure just covers a huge number of things. So you have digital infrastructure, you have power infrastructure, you have the physical infrastructure on the ground where they're going to land, you have the airspace infrastructure and how you actually deal with that. And so these are the things that working with organizations like NASA, so I'm an advisor to the AAM working groups number 2 and 3, and the Vertical Flight Society, working closely with them, trying to help those organizations understand what is required in terms of infrastructure. And I said that I did my MBA paper on buying an aircraft carrier. When you look at that kind of infrastructure and vertiport infrastructures in cities and how they operate with the city, because I'm a strong believer that vertiports have to complement public transportation and should not compete with public transportation. The last thing that we should be doing as vertiport planners is designing a vertiport where all of a sudden everybody has to get on a taxi to get to the vertiport and get away from the vertiport. They should be making the best use of the public transport. So this is where I have a slightly different view from maybe what Uber has been presenting in their conversions of car parks, because I just don't think that you have the ground infrastructure available. In 2018, they had a beautiful concept that would do 10,000 passengers per annum on about 3.5 acres of land. And as an airport planner, I would love to work on something like that. It would just be so amazing. But equally, it's a dystopian solution in that if we need that type of infrastructure, then our town planners have utterly failed us. And you'd be much better to put that money into public transportation system than to build that thing. But to put it into context, 10,000 passengers per annum on 3.5 acres of land, whereas LAX, they only can do 20,000 passengers per hour, but on 2.5, 3,000 acres of land. So you can just imagine the ground chaos that would be created by something that is that significant. But it was an exercise of the possible. So there's lots that needs to be done in the infrastructure side. And again, this is why I'm working with Anna and Yolenka within CAMI and an advisor to CAMI and trying to help local authorities understand what is needed in that infrastructure and striking the right balance. Because if we don't get it right, if the public don't accept what we're trying to do, then we just won't get the planning application approvals because there will just be too much opposition.
It strikes me, and this has happened in rural. Broadband was brought to rural areas in some of the first places because it was a lot easier. There wasn't the bureaucratic stuff. There wasn't the opposition that you'd have in a city like San Jose or something where there's 1 million people and they don't want this or that. So it seems like there could be opportunities there, especially if you have a general aviation airplane to start to pilot some of these things. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I think we have so much infrastructure available. So in one of my presentations, I show this Google Earth image of about 970 potential operating locations in the United Kingdom. and that's down to general aviation, airports, helipads, or whatever, wherever there was an aviation activity. Now, of course, not all of them are going to be viable, but every country that I looked at, they have this rich history in general aviation. And of course, within Europe or the European context, a lot of that was actually born out of the wars. So of course, here in the UK, we celebrated VE Day today. So if you look back in history, this infrastructure exists. It's there for us to utilize. So hopefully this will bring the cost down. And the great thing about electric is that hopefully it's going to be a lot quieter than hydrocarbon aircraft. So there is the potential that these aircraft could be operating at night without disturbing the neighbors. And so you think in terms of a real setting, that could open up nighttime cargo operations that you wouldn't normally have. So electric can just really change the way that we look at aviation, and not even to mention the carbon footprint issue.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, Daryl, I think that, in my presentation, I showed some of the eVTOL aircraft because those are kind of the new thing that maybe people aren't as familiar with. But it's really important to not forget that we're electrifying the existing general aviation fleet, either by starting with new aircraft or by retrofitting existing airframes. So it's not just about this new swanky configuration, but it's about kind of revolutionizing how we use existing general aviation aircraft and existing general aviation infrastructure in ways that are quieter and more environmentally friendly. And just like the nighttime cargo operations at a GA field is a perfect example of what that opens up. So maybe you would be taking an eVTOL aircraft that's going to go from your rural airport into the city center, so you can land at a vertiport that's downtown, but maybe you're doing cargo operations with a retrofitted Cessna Caravan or something like that, that's doing really basic normal feeder flights, but now has many more options for when they can do that and are doing that in a much more friendly manner.
Yeah, and while we're I was just going to say, while we're on that topic of short takeoff landing type aircraft, one of the questions that came in was, do you see a surge in this kind of development? It kind of sounds like you're answering that question, Anna, but also, do you see these as all electric or, kind of hybrid? I know there are some that are doing kind of hybrid. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of investment that's going into this space right now. Some of the major auto players are making significant investments. There's a lot of interest and a lot of money going into the electrification of the fleet and for developing new electric aircraft both. So I think, yes, there's a lot happening on both sides of that, and I think they're very complementary to each other. In terms of Ken, I'm sorry, I just blanked on the second part of the thing I was going to say. What was the second half of that question?
Well, I think it was just the whole idea of, now I'm going into cargo because I started looking at the cargo thing, but no, it's just the ability to use the short takeoff and landing, and if there'll be a surge in that. So I think you addressed it.
Yeah, no, there's, and I think, and the hybrid was the other piece.
Oh,
so
the hybrid,
so it depends on the mission. It depends on how far you need to go. So some of these aircraft are pure electric. Some of them are hybrid electric, where they can generate additional charge en route. The vertical takeoff using electric motors and the distributed propulsion that allows is sort of a fundamental piece. So if you're going to do an eVTOL aircraft, if you have a hybrid component to that, it will be to extend your range en route and recharge your batteries, so then you can land vertically again on electric motors at your destination. In terms of sort of conventional aircraft, I see less excitement around the hybrid configurations there, because you don't have as much benefit of having an electric motor with a generator as you do for an eVTOL scenario, for conventional takeoff and landing. But yeah, Daryl, you seeing the same thing, or?
Well, yeah, no, I'd have to agree with that. I think that there's probably a little bit more of a limiting factor on the conventional electric aircraft, in that you really can't fly much further than the average person's bladder will last. Unless you start putting a WC on those aircraft. So there are those natural limiting factors. But of course, the speed, because it is a propeller-driven aircraft, they think possibly 1,000 nautical miles, possibly, but you're only doing 200 or 300 miles an hour. So that could be 2.5, 3, 4 hour flight trips, which is not unreasonable. but those types of aircraft just open up so much opportunities, and we're thinking about again this cargo and how it could possibly fit in with our hub and spoke system airports. If you have an electric aircraft operating at a hub and spoke airport at night where there are night restrictions, chances are the aircraft is going to be so quiet that even operating at full thrust, you won't wake up the neighbors. Now, of course, you'll say landing one small aircraft on a runway system is actually not a huge dent in terms of the operations or delivering huge amounts of volume, but you can actually do a runway within a runway concept. So you can have displaced thresholds. So all of a sudden, one runway for a 747 cargo aircraft could be 3 or 4 for an electric fixed wing aircraft. So this is where you start to generate the volume of traffic in a distributed way that actually makes economic sense to the operators.
Hey, Ken.
Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to ask a question to Daryl and Anna, because in my work, particularly now related to COVID-19, there's an enormous amount of discussion in Washington, D.C. about stimulus and also about infrastructure, that perhaps one of the ways to get people back to work is an infrastructure bill, a massive infrastructure bill with which our government has been talking about for some time. I even sat in a hearing one time where I was sort of the broadband guy in between. I think I had railroads and I had bridges and I had, the airplane industry, so I was in the middle of all of these industries where everybody's looking for help from the government to expand their industry, whether they're long-standing industries or they're new industries. From a standpoint of your industry and the development there, how do you see it primarily really expanding? Do you think it's primarily more through private investment that's more entrepreneurial, or do you see really a heavy ability of government to really tip the scales in favor of your industries?
From the perspective of a European perspective, so I'm a Canadian, but I've been in the UK for 25 years, gosh. A lot of the work that I work on or used to work on was airport transactions, so helping people buy airports. So it really was private investment into infrastructure, and I would really advocate private investment in that type of infrastructure, because that's where I think the money could quite happily come from without having to rely on the public purse for those types of funds. Now, I know that the funding of aviation infrastructure is very different in the US. But I also know that for the past 7, 8 to 10 years, they've been trying to privatize a lot of their airports. And every time that they try to privatize the airport, that it just falls through because of so much objection to it. But then again, when I look at the quality of the infrastructure of the US airports versus the quality of some of the airport infrastructure in Europe and around the world, private investment can work. But yes, you are paying private companies to make the money, and they will try and reach into your pockets every possible chance that they get to remove money from your pockets when you're passing through the terminal. And I know because I designed them, whereas the US model is a little bit different. But I would probably advocate more the private investment because I think it's more efficient. But Anna, what your thoughts?
Well, yeah, no, it's interesting because one of the challenges that I think the UM industry has right now is they have not yet sold the local decision makers, like the state DOT level, at least not at a universal level. There are some that are more on board and understand and ahead of the curve. But I think generally speaking, there has not yet been the demonstration of why this is sufficient public good to make it be worth public investment. So there is a pushback of we shouldn't be publicly subsidizing Uber or whoever it is, right, the operator. And I think that is something that there's a real sensitivity to, and I think there could be some valid points around where I think there is a role for certainly public guidance and potentially public investment is with ensuring that this technology really can be used to unlock some of the societal challenges that urban transportation faces and rural transportation particularly. In the US, we have a couple of programs that actually directly subsidize air connectivity for rural locations. So you're paying regional airlines to provide flights in and out of areas that would not be commercially viable based on volume otherwise. And I think that that's important. And I think that especially in rural areas will likely persist and adapt for this new industry. And I think as we start looking at the urban transportation landscape, where there's social equity issues of transportation deserts and areas where there really isn't a strong connectivity from that location to economic opportunities elsewhere in that metropolitan area, that there could very well be a role for either a public-private partnership or public investment directly in that, in those pieces of connectivity. So I would say from my personal perspective that there's a role for both, and that the industry at large has a responsibility to prove that it has enough value to be worthy of public funds. And I think that's one of the things that CAMI has stepped up to try to do, is not to advocate on behalf of the industry, but to make that information more widely available and try to explain what the public role is in all of this and how we can leverage this for the greater public good beyond what has kind of captured the public imagination, which is the sort of private air taxi service.
Yeah, I would suggest, well, in Europe and Canada, we have these PSO, public service obligation flights, which is exactly what you're talking about, government subsidies of regional airlines to provide that connectivity. In Scotland, a airline called Loganair is the recipient of funding to provide connections in these Scottish islands and up north. And that's a brilliant thing. We absolutely need that. I saw that in the north in Canada. I know that Scandinavia, Norway in particular, have a very strong PSO because of the geography that they have. But if you imagine those carriers are able to utilize fixed-wing electric aircraft to access those markets, then all of a sudden the costs come down. So you could actually reduce your requirement for public funding for those types of operations, and still provide a viable income for these airlines, and increase connectivity, because the prices of travel will come down. So all of a sudden, you're getting this triple hit of reduced environmental impact, increased social mobility of airlines, and a reduced costs to the government. So everybody's a winner.
Sounds a lot like broadband, doesn't it, Matt?
Very much so. I mean, it's the fight for funds and the ability to deploy, to have not only private investment, which really is the engine for what our members are doing to deploy broadband. I mean, literally in some of the most remote areas of the country, very, very hard to reach. And in some cases, the only way you can reach them is by airplane, or something that like Daryl and Ann are talking about. So it very much is a public-private partnership. But when now we're talking about, COVID-19, getting people back to work, finding new ways to stimulate the economy, this might be a great opportunity that their industry hasn't had before to really step up.
That's a good point. One of the things that, I did an analysis, it was obviously back of an envelope analysis based on the economics George Buy was kind of, as Buy Aerospace has kind of been purporting to be able to, have in terms of the cost per mile for electricity versus hydrocarbons. And I compared it to the cost of high-speed rail, for the 75-mile loop rail that they plan on opening between Merced and San Jose, and it was cheaper, and it would be done faster, and it would also be a lot more flexible. It would be, where you wouldn't have to, the catchment area to Merced to get people to San Jose, you could go more direct community to community. Any comments on that as far as where does this fit with some of those fixed infrastructure alternatives?
Well, it's interesting. In Europe, it's only governments that invest in heavy rail infrastructure. And the reason for that is the payback period is 75 to 120 years by the time you tot up the total capital cost, where an airport is a fixed asset on a small piece of land, and you can squeeze the life out of it and get your capital back in a reasonable period of time. But I would caution people from looking at it just that way, because you have to look at it on a balanced perspective. a rail infrastructure that you're building or maintaining, you depreciate it over 75, 100 years, but you're also moving huge volumes of people. Whereas aviation, yes, you can move at volume, but maybe not necessarily what rail can on the thick routes. But of course, rail is fixed to the lines that they cover, whereas aviation is ultimately flexible. If you can get a piece of land, 700-meter runway, put it in there, you can develop a fixed wing electric airport and then operate eVTOL out of there. And a vertiport itself, 2-3 acres of land is really all you need to have a reasonable bit of infrastructure. So it really is horses for courses.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there's really a lot to be said for trying to do these things in concert with each other. So using the eVTOL and the EE aircraft to feed the larger infrastructure projects and to feed public transportation. So I don't think it has to be an either or. There may be markets in which it makes sense to leapfrog a rail project with an EE aircraft project. But I think there's probably more markets where it makes sense to use them in concert with each other. So I don't think it has to be an either or sort of scenario.
Well, funny enough, two of the concepts that I developed with Pascal and Watson, architects here in London, one of them was on St. Pancras Station in London. And of course, they just had this big, beautiful roof that was available. And of course, you think about power, there's a lot of electrified rail there and its connection to the underground system. And then the other one that we developed, of course, you can find it on my LinkedIn page, is the development of a site near Waterloo Station. So again, it's using that synergy of the Waterloo rail, the heavy rail station, plus the underground, water taxi, and other modes of transport to really get people to where they want to. So there's this massive synergy between rail and electric aviation that I think that we need to leverage.
Absolutely.
Interesting idea here on that the chat feed for the stream. It says you could use an eVTOL for ski lifts. Interesting idea. It'd be faster than getting the permits from the Forest Service, I'm sure. Daryl, another question was on why would VTOL or short takeoff and landing be necessary if you're replacing conventional fixed wing aircraft on PSO EAS routes? Their infrastructure is 1,500 feet already. I think you may have addressed this already in terms of being able to maybe get more capacity with the shorter runways, but I don't want to answer it for you.
Well, no, I think you're right in terms of on those PSO flights. It's really about providing fixed wing electric aircraft to the operators as they're replacing their fleet, replace them with an electric aircraft, and they'll be able to operate them cheaper. And possibly into shorter airfields. So all of a sudden, more airfields become viable for you to operate out of course, because fixed ground infrastructure is actually quite expensive. So a square meter of tarmac for a runway might cost you about £300-400 per square meter. So obviously, as your runways get longer, then the capital cost just goes up and then your maintenance costs go up. So if we can keep the infrastructure as tight as we possibly can and small, and we be frugal, but still provide that connectivity, again, everybody wins.
From an infrastructure standpoint, maybe, I don't know, 3 weeks ago or so, I was on a webinar that was talking about using hydrogen as the fuel and fuel cells. And it seemed like a whole ecosystem is kind of building up around that. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm kind of agnostic when it comes to the fuel system. I'm not an expert on battery versus hydrogen. I understand the challenges in both. They'll both have their infrastructure costs that we'll have to provide for it. Hydrogen is very interesting. A lot of it comes down to the source of the electrons to make the hydrogen. How do you store it? How are you using it as a fuel cell, or are you actually burning it in engines designed to burn hydrogen? So we still have a hydrogen economy to build. And there are countries around the world that actually have more of a hydrogen economy available. So those vehicles may gravitate towards them. But my instinct as an airport planner is, tell me what you need and I'll find a way to plan and deliver it. the interesting thing will be for smaller regional airports, if we see this push towards electric aviation, is actually getting electricity there, because a lot of them have a very limited supply. So I'm actually predicting that the smaller regional airports will be those first investors in those giga batteries to serve the electric airlines. But then they'll also sell that power back to the grid during the peak time. So they'll get the off-peak electricity when it's relatively cheap, store it, use it for their own customers, and then sell it back to the grid. So again, they have two sources of income for one capital expense.
Where the electric co-ops.
I'm sorry, say again?
Matt has a lot of electric co-ops as members.
We do a lot that would be very interested. I have one quick question. This maybe gets more to the consumer side, but do you think the traveling public's ready for electric?
Ooh, Anna, I think that's one for you.
Well, yeah. You know, I think that my personal opinion on this is that people don't care so much about what it is that's pushing them around. They care about their experience. They care about the perception, the actual safety of the vehicle, but the perception of safety of the vehicle. Does it feel like you know, in a car, does it feel like you have a good pickup? You know, those kinds of things. And I think for the aircraft side of things, I think it's going to be the same. If you get on any aircraft and it feels solid and it has a good safety record and the wing loading is high enough that you aren't going to lose your lunch, and it's a pleasant experience that gets you where you want to be at a good value, I think, sure, absolutely, people are ready for whatever it takes to make that happen. I think that the technology in many ways is, you know, is just kind of transparent. You know, that's not the point. The point is what the functionality is. And if we can demonstrate that electric is, I believe it's going to be safer. So if we can demonstrate that it's safer and quieter and more environmentally friendly and more cost effective, I think, of course, people are ready for all of those things. Now, the conversation for another day about some of the other features of these aircraft, the autonomy and that kind of thing. But I think from a propulsion perspective, I don't see the acceptance as being a real hurdle there.
Yeah, it is going to be kind of mentally a step backward into smaller aircraft, and they are a little bit more susceptible to bouncing around in the sky with weather, and that's going to be a big factor with vertiport location and whether or not they become commercially viable. But I think the other interesting thing is that even when we get aircraft certified, it's still going to be a time for them to ramp up production. So we're going to see a bit of a drip feed of vehicles into the market, and then people will be getting used to it. And then you'll get these stories, oh, I had my first eVTOL ride the other week, or whatever they're going to be calling it, or I was on a BHA and we had a great experience. And then as more and more vehicles become available in the system, that social acceptance will be slowly taken on, because it really is about social acceptance. We have to get that social acceptance. So I actually think it's playing to the industry, and I think that was probably the same when cars were first invented. People would see them and go, "Oh my God, what the heck is this thing?" And people flag them walking in front of them. But then,
that's my favorite anecdote. Yes.
yeah, stealing some of your thunder. But as people get used to it, then it will just become a natural way for us to choose to fly. And I think electric aviation is just going to be another icon at the top of whatever app we use for choosing to travel. And it will say, here you go, here's your different choices, and you're paid for it, and you're confirmed, and you'll take a train here, and then you'll get on an eVTOL, and you'll go there, and away you go.
You kind of touched upon the whole experience idea, which Anna talked about earlier, but this whole idea of kind of a single ticket or whatever it is, whether it's a phone or whatever, so that you leave your house, it gets you to your destination, and that might be multiple modes, right? So do you see the industry kind of working towards that kind of future?
Yeah, that's that's what the industry is calling mobility as a service, and we're really already starting to see that move towards mobility as a service. So it's really an app can pay for multiple modes. Will do all the planning for you and communicate with you, and that's what I think we're really trying to move towards, especially as we move into autonomy. Eventually, sooner or later, we'll have autonomous cars, and that will be part of the solution. Is just a seamless way of booking your tickets. It's analogous to what's happened in the last 20 years in aviation, where you would go to a travel agent and you would get your paper ticket, and you would have to book your taxi separately, or your parking at an airport and drive. Now people just do it all online via a couple of apps, and in fact, there are airports which are offering to do connections between low-cost carriers because they see that as an opportunity. So passengers are making those self connections. And I see the same thing happening with electric aviation. So I talk about sub-regional hubs. So this is where you will have a hub or a regional airport with services, might be by different carriers, but passengers will start self-connecting between those two as a more efficient way of traveling via the hub and spoke airport system. So this is how that mobility of a service will evolve.
What fascinates me is the whole idea of community development and what this could lead to in terms of just economic development in an area that may have been ignored because it's too hard to get to.
Yeah, and I think that develops for a number of reasons, sort of accidentally as you build up a city, and sometimes it's geography, and sometimes it's economics, and we have an opportunity here to fix a lot of things that maybe we maybe could have gotten ahead of had we thought about it originally, but we didn't. So now I think there's, if we do this thoughtfully, I think it's going to be really exciting for addressing some of these issues going forward.
Yeah, and we kind of ended on several topics were brought up here about the remote cargo sabering. I think is that how you say it? Sabering, right?
Saberwing, yeah.
Saberwing, of course. I interviewed the founder of that a couple months ago. It sounds like they're making some great progress in the great state of Alaska with one of the native groups there, and but they're using kind of semi-autonomous. I think they're going to be. I don't know if it's remote piloted, but they're going to be in communication with these things. And it seems like that's a real good transition step from, getting things from cities to rural areas.
I like the Saberwing model, and there are a few companies out there that do something similar. And if anybody from Saberwing is watching, they should get in touch with Loganair in Scotland, because one of the challenges that they actually have is aircraft on ground. So because they fly to a lot of remote airports where they haven't got maintenance facilities, if something goes tech, then all of a sudden they've got to either charter in a helicopter or something, and you have aircraft sitting on ground. So that kind of a solution would be absolutely brilliant, provided that we can get the airspace and the BB loss beyond visual line of sight issue sorted out. So I think the cargo option is interesting. I think if you can get some fixed-wing electric aircraft certified for the propulsion system for cargo carrying, that requirement is a lot lesser than for passengers. So you could use that as your mode of proving the powertrain within the aircraft and the battery pack and the components. So it's a potential path to offering or to getting aircraft certified.
And I put this in the description, so I have to ask the question. Anna, you made comments on the Agility Prime event last week, the Air Force program, and my impression, it was a huge event, and I only watched glimpses of it, your presentation being part of it, but my takeaway was this could be a historical event. Looking back 20 years from now, maybe people will look at this and say, this is a big deal. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's, I think it's fantastic that there's this level of interest and commitment to sort of this new technology and these new aircraft. And I don't know, I think they did a fantastic job putting that event together. So, you know, if things continue as they've sort of started in terms of having a streamlined contracting process and some realistic goals in terms of using commercially viable product for their applications, I think it could really be something significant. In the past, I participated in DARPA programs and other things that were looking at eVTOL and other vertical technology, and the military specific requirements were often prohibitive to a successful design. Given the constraints of the technology. So I think if there's a different mindset in play here, and it seems like there is, that this could really be of a great benefit to the industry as well as to the armed forces. But I'm cautiously optimistic that it's really going to be great. And I think they've done a really good job setting it up. So we'll see how it proceeds.
Yeah, it was amazing. They had FAA, they had the Department of Transportation, senators, Murkowski from Alaska, I believe, and you know, it was well attended, right, from a lot of different groups.
Yeah, and there were thousands of people that dialed in, so definitely made a splash. And it was great. I really, hats off to Nate and his team. I think they really did a fantastic job.
Excellent. Well, it's closing in on an hour here, and I really appreciate everyone joining in today on this, both on the YouTube channel, but also here in person on our screens. And do you guys have any closing comments?
I'll just start. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Anna.
No, go ahead.
Well, as the novice here, I'll just say it's a fascinating thing. I have the chance to work with a lot of members who are very innovative every day to solve problems in very hard to reach communities. And it's great to hear, others from other industries, but related in many ways, all trying to do the same thing, which is what we try to do at ACA Connects and our members. And we say they connect and communicate. And that's really what you're doing as well. You're connecting people and allowing them to communicate in person and literally across the world. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I was going to say similarly, thank you for the opportunity. And, CAMI exists to provide resources and education and answer questions. So no such thing as a stupid question. Feel free to reach out through our website, communityairmobility.org.
Excellent. And Daryl?
Right. Well, I haven't got a .org behind my name, but just have a look at my LinkedIn page, or you can follow me.
Daryl through our website too.
He is on there.
Yeah, I'm on the CAMI website, and I'm happy to support CAMI because I think it's these types of organizations that we need to really get that social acceptance. And I think as much as we're focusing on designing infrastructure and planning for it or doing vehicles, the industry itself needs to come together and really work on that social acceptance side, because again, without the wider public accepting this new form of transportation and what it actually means, then we're just not going to get that planning permission. So well done, Anna, Yolanka. You have my support on that, and then I'm hoping that you guys sooner or later are going to be able to open up a branch in Europe so that we can get the initiative going over here. For myself, if anybody has any questions, you can contact me through my LinkedIn page, or you can follow me on Twitter at Daryl Aviation.
Well, and I failed to disclose one thing. I probably should have disclosed at the beginning. I'm also on the San Jose Airport Commission, but the views and any stupid things that came out of my mouth are totally my own. They have nothing to do with the SJC, the greatest airport in the world. Sorry, Matt. You'd probably have a different view. But no, anyway, these are all totally my views. And I really appreciate, again, everyone's participation in this. Next week, we're going to have Jeff Leslie from ITS Fiber. And he is in the Himalayas of South Florida. I think they're 40 feet above sea level. And he's been building resiliency in his fiber network from day one. So we're going to learn about how he's resilient in times like these. So I'm looking forward to that. And again, thank you for being on this. And why don't you guys stay on for a second? Oh, and thank you to all the people in YouTube. Thank you to the Vertical Flight Society and Yolanka for chiming in and helping answer questions as we went along. So I'm in the stream. So